my friends are simps.
Anytime that I'm looking at buying new bits of electronic music gear, one of the key considerations that I take into account is whether or not it has MIDI connectivity and what type it is. The reason for this is obviously the MIDI is that magical language that allows all of these weird and wonderful devices that I've collected over the years to talk to each other and hopefully produce beautiful sounds, or perhaps more commonly, not so beautiful sounds, as the case may be. Now, there are different types of MIDI connection available, and I have never been shy about voicing my distaste for the minijack variety. However, that's a bit of an oversimplification of what is a kind of complicated issue. Recently, somebody left this comment on one of my videos saying that minijack is only for toys, not for serious musical instruments, and to be honest, that really pissed me off. Not least because it's totally incorrect, but also because this idea that devices can't be for serious or real music making just because of the type of socket that are on there, it's just total gatekeeping shite. As a result of this comment though, I realised that I've never actually explained why I dislike minijack MIDI or the various nuances that are involved, and so the time has come. Let's talk about TRS MIDI. Before we dive into any of my personal thoughts on the great MIDI format war, it's probably important to lay out a few basics, namely that MIDI is effectively just a common protocol or a shared language, if you will, that has messages that can be transmitted across different mediums. This includes Ethernet, Bluetooth, Firewire, and a host of others, but most relevant for our purposes as electronic musicians, or at least for this conversation anyway, also USB, DIN, and minijack. DIN is probably the connection that is most closely associated with MIDI. These are the big chunky round plugs that you'll commonly find on perhaps older bits of gear like synthesizers and sequencers and what have you. These have got 5 pins in them, but only 3 of them are actually used, and so rather cleverly manufacturers started to repurpose 3.5mm TRS or stereo connections as smaller, more economical alternatives. With both of these you can connect up devices together directly, although the signal only flows one way, which is why you've got MIDI in, MIDI out and MIDI through connections all separately. USB MIDI is another common connection. This transmits the data digitally, obviously, and is bidirectional, so only one physical jack is required, at least in theory anyway. Things get a wee bit complicated here because you can't just connect up all your USB MIDI devices together and expect them to work flawlessly. An inherent part of USB communication is that one device has to act as a host to kind of control and corral all of the information. So generally speaking anyway, if you want to connect up a USB MIDI controller, which has got a USB connection, to a hardware synthesizer that also has a USB MIDI connection, you're going to need some kind of box in the middle to act as the host. I should say that there are notable exceptions to this, by the way, and in practice it's obviously a wee bit more complicated. I'm simplifying things here for the purposes of this illustration, so bear with me, but the main point is that many people, including myself, prefer non-USB MIDI connections as they provide more immediate flexibility and don't require the use of something like a middle host box in order to make it all work together. If you do need a USB host, there's a whole load of options available out there, including one called the Blockass MIDI Hub and various devices from Kenton. However, I personally have been using the RK006 from RetroKits. I've done a video on this before. It's not a sponsored video or anything, so that's even more reason to watch it, I guess. Now, there's no denying the fact that USB MIDI is very handy and can be great for many scenarios. However, it isn't ideal in every situation. There are plenty of circumstances where you really just want a physical MIDI jack. But why is it that I dislike or feel so strongly about minijack or TRS MIDI connections in particular? I can tell you straight up that my hatred for minijack MIDI is not because of some misplaced preconception or elitist attitude about the status of the physical jack itself. Definitely not. Instead, it's more about the way that the format originally was rolled out and developed and the lasting impact that that has had since. Effectively, when manufacturers started to implement TRS MIDI into their devices, there was no agreed upon standard for the way that these should be wired. Two particular approaches emerged as a result: TRS Type A and TRS Type B, with companies basically just picking whatever one they wanted to use effectively. These are not compatible with each other directly, and that has led to a scenario where you can have two different bits of gear that both use minijack connections, but because they use different types of TRS MIDI wiring, that means you have to use minijack to DIN converters on each side with a DIN cable in the middle, which is just madness. Even more frustratingly, these adapters look exactly the same and are rarely physically marked. Similarly, the devices aren't physically marked with the type of TRS minijack connections that they use, and so if you want to use a particular sequencer with a particular, synthesizer, even if they both use minijack MIDI, then you first have to figure out what type of minijack MIDI they use, find an adapter, and it's just a pain in the arse. Now, of course, yes, you could make this a bit easier by labeling all of your gear and all of your cables, but really, why should we have to do that? Effectively, what they've done is taken what was a universal standard and complicated things unnecessarily, which is one of the big reasons that I hate TRS minijack MIDI. Eventually, in 2018, TRS Type A was finally adopted by the MIDI Association as the industry standard. However, by this point, loads of different devices had already been produced. Similarly, certain manufacturers decided to stick with their original choice of TRS Type B in order to maintain compatibility within their own range of products. So, for example, Pauline's Play and Tracker both use TRS Type B MIDI, even though they came out after the standard of TRS Type A was adopted. I understand why this is the case, but it's still a huge pain in the arse. Funnily enough, actually, this is something that I've seen people online get confused about all the time, including people, by the way, who should definitely know better. There was one video in particular by somebody who will remain nameless for their own good, where they were reviewing the Dreadbox MIDI synthesizer, and they started criticising Dreadbox because they weren't able to connect up the synth directly to a sequencer and have it work with a stereo aux cable. The irony here was that it wasn't Dreadbox's fault at all. In fact, they were adhering to the TRS Type A standard. It was the other device that didn't adhere to the standard, and even then it could have been produced before the standard was in place, so there's all this confusion about it, even from folks who apparently know what they're talking about. I did try and find that video, by the way, to reference it, but it appears to have disappeared, interestingly enough. Now, it's not just a compatibility issue that makes mini-jack connections irritating either. They're also generally less physically robust than DIN is. And that's something that you have to take into consideration, especially if you're playing live or if you're spending a lot of money on gear, because longevity is important. Now, to be clear, TRS MIDI isn't an entirely bad thing at all. Far from it, actually. There are plenty of great reasons that you might want to use a mini-jack connection. Firstly, and most importantly perhaps, it allows us to have MIDI connectivity on smaller devices. For example, there is simply no way that a full-sized DIN jack would fit on a portable device like the Dirtywave M8, Torso T5 or the aux A1. The compact nature of TRS MIDI means that both inputs and outputs can be squeezed in nicely, and that we don't have to just use USB MIDI, which has its own limitations as I've already outlined. To kind of illustrate this point, I did a video recently talking about just how excited I was to discover that the Airy Touch from Embodme, which is this MIDI controller, implemented TRS minijack MIDI connections on there as well as USB, because it made it so much more useful in a live environment. Another positive about TRS MIDI is that the cost of 3.5mm jack sockets is far lower per unit than the larger DIN connections. This is attractive to manufacturers for obvious reasons, but in theory it can also contribute to devices being offered at a cheaper price point. Whether that is actually the case in practice or not, of course, is probably up for debate. In a similar vein though, mini jack connections are also a much easier physical format to work with for those folks who customize or circuit bend or design their own DIY devices. I know this for a fact through my own bitter experience that a 3.5mm hole is much easier to drill and work with than one of those big full-size DIN holes would be. In fact, the Game Boy mod scene has actually been utilising minijack MIDI connections for a long time, partly because of this reason, and it might even have been Trash 80 of Dirty Wave M8 fame that did so, but don't quote me on that one. Finally, one other thing that I like about TRS MIDI is that you can use any old stereo cable that you have lying around. That means, you know, the aux cable that you would plug into your iPod, for example, although I think that reference probably ages me horribly. The point is that these cables are much more ubiquitous than MIDI cables are, and so in theory this can be much more convenient, so long as both devices respect the MIDI standard, of course, which they probably don't. Despite the prevalence of minijack MIDI at this point and its obvious issues, there are surprisingly few commercial solutions out there to make everything a wee bit easier. There are notable exceptions though, and retro kits in particular have got a couple of gadgets in their product line which look pretty good. They make a TRS Type A to TRS Type B converter for a start. This can be really great if you want to connect up two different devices that both use minijack MIDI but have got different implementations. However, it does mean that you need to remember which device uses Type A, and it also doesn't help if you want to use DIN jack devices. For that scenario, retro kits have also got this thing called the RK TRS-X, which is effectively a DIN-shaped plug that goes into the back of the full-sized MIDI DIN connections on your sequencer or synth or whatever. It's got two mini jack connections on the rear, corresponding to both types of mini jack MIDI. If you're not sure which type or which implementation your particular device supports, it's as simple as just switching the cable from one to the other, which is incredibly useful and much simpler than having to dig out various adapters. So to summarise, minijack is a great way to provide non-USB MIDI compatibility on devices which otherwise couldn't fit full-size DIN jacks, opening up a host of different possibilities and something that I welcome. Unfortunately, the checkered legacy of its adoption has meant that it can be far fiddlier and less straightforward than it should be to use, even now that a standard has been adopted. Whilst I am always going to encourage manufacturers to include some kind of non-USB MIDI functionality on their devices, even if it has to be minijack, DIN is still king, and there really is no excuse for using TRS where there's plenty of space and possibility for the good old faithful. I'm looking at you, Akai Force, by the way. Anyway, hopefully this clears things up so that I can't be accused of being some kind of MIDI elitist anytime soon. What do you think about all of this? Do you think I'm talking shite? Do you think this is all a storm in a teacup? In fact, I don't actually care. I don't want to know. Don't leave a comment, don't like the video, and definitely do not subscribe.